More needs to be done regarding healing and reconciliation between the faith communities and indigenous peoples.
And the government needs to be involved in the reconciliation process also.
The American Religious Town Hall meeting is now in session.
Welcome, friends, to the American Religious Town Hall meeting, where the discussion of religious, political, and social issues is meant to promote the cause of religious freedom and to help us better understand each other. And now, here's your host and moderator, Pastor Jerry Lutz.
Hello, I'm Andrea Luxton, filling in for Pastor Lutz. We have a fascinating topic today and some great panelists, and I'd like them now to introduce themselves.
Hello, my name is Mel ROBECK. I am Senior Professor of Church History and Ecumenics and Special Assistant to the President for Ecumenical Relations at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California. I'm also an ordained minister with the Assemblies of God.
My name is Canon John Peterson. I am an Episcopal priest and I'm canonically resident in the Diocese of Washington, D.C.
Hi, I'm Carl TROVALL. I'm Professor of Ethics and History at Concordia University in Austin, Texas, which is affiliated with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod.
Hello, I'm Tony Matthews, and I'm the Senior Pastor at North Garland Baptist Fellowship in Garland, Texas.
Thank you all very much to the panelists, and now for our topic for today. In June 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada released an executive summary of its findings, along with 94 calls to action regarding reconciliation between Canadians and Indigenous peoples. One of the most visible of these actions that has impacted all Canadians is the land acknowledgements that have become part of most public events, as well as being posted at many transit locations. These acknowledgements are intended to honor the original occupants of the place where an event is occurring and note their kinship to that land. The curator of Indigenous Arts at the Art Gallery of Ontario notes that these acknowledgements, quote, are a starting place to a change in how the land is seen and talked about. They help redefine how people place themselves in relation to First Peoples. The 94 calls to action have also included actions in the areas of child welfare, education, language and culture, health and justice. And amongst these are very specific calls for apologies and reconciliation from church communities due to the significant involvement of church-run organizations and residential schools in some of the abuse to the First Peoples of Canada. Canada has to date gone much further than the United States in systematizing a response to the realities of the past for the First Peoples or Native Americans. Arguably, their response has increased public awareness and appreciation of the culture and history of these communities, allowing healing and increasing future opportunities for all peoples. Nevertheless, some would argue that acknowledging land as a forced part of public events, for example, becomes a formality that brings little attitudinal change. So the panel is asked to consider at least the following questions. Number one, does the United States have anything to learn from Canada in the consistently public way it is acknowledging the wrongs of the past and the value of the First Peoples, Native Americans? Or has Canada gone too far? Number two, since religious organizations were so integral to the abuses experienced by Native Americans in the past, is there more that should be done by our faith communities to create healing and bring reconciliation? And number three, what is the nature of engagement of your faith community with the Native American community? With those ideas in mind, we'll move back to our first two speakers. So to start with, John Peterson.
Thank you. At the outset, I want to say how much I appreciate this program, as painful as it is. On many recent programs, we have spoken about the impact of racism in the United States. But today we turn to a program that shows the living disaster, literally the living disaster of the impact of racism in Canada. In discussing this, I want to be totally transparent. I was Secretary General of the Anglican Communion at the time when these abuses in some of the residential schools was being uncovered. And during this time, I was also briefed frequently on what the Anglican Church in Canada was doing. I want to say, in many ways, although not perfect, the Anglican Church in Canada is an example today for all of us of what needs to be done to correct the evils of abuse done to the non-white community, which in Canada happens to be the Indigenous nations, the Indigenous peoples. As the moderator has pointed out, abuse has been uncovered in the residential schools run by 4 different churches in Canada. These 4 churches are the Roman Catholic, the Anglican Church of Canada, the United Church of Canada, and the Presbyterian Church in Canada. The abuse was both physical as well as sexual. This abuse was rampant in the residential schools, with children even being beaten for speaking their native language. For speaking their native language, they were abused. Other reasons for physical abuse was bedwetting, running away, smiling at children of the opposite sex, or at one's siblings. All these behaviors provoked whippings, strappings, beatings, and other forms of abuse and humiliation. From the 19th century to 1970s, more than 150,000 Indigenous children were forced to attend state-funded Christian boarding schools in the effort to assimilate them into Canadian society. That was the purpose of the residential schools. Thousands of children died of disease, particularly of TB and other causes, and many were never returned to their families. Abuse ran rampant.
Thank you very much, Dr. TROVALL.
Thank you, John, for that very graphic and detailed description of the kind of oppression that happened and abuse. I appreciate that. I want to zoom way out and talk about both the complicity of the Christian church as well as their government that they created in the taking of the land of the indigenous peoples, because this goes so far back. In fact, it goes all the way back to the Treaty of Tordesillas, which goes, it's in 1494. It's a treaty that's established essentially by the Pope. And everyone remembers it because it divides it divides the Portuguese and Spanish holdings in the New World. But here's what to me is so interesting about it, is that it also had the clause that if any Christian would occupy a land of a non-Christian, they have the right to squat and take the land from the heathen so that they themselves can occupy it and own it. And that's a part of the treaty. And of course, Protestant Europe, not just Catholic Europe, also took that as justification for their taking of the land of the indigenous peoples because they weren't Christian. Now, the treaty did say if they're Christian people, you can't take their land. But if they're non-Christian people, you can, which is a very interesting policy. My point is that the connection between faith and the land being taken from indigenous peoples is so connected with governmental power as well as faith communities. So that's why I think the government as well as faith communities should be involved in the reconciliation process. And of course, when the settlers came, it's called in academics and history, it's called settler colonialism, where you squat on the land and essentially take it, eventually by just bringing in more and more, at that time, Europeans, right? If any of you are interested in the history of this, check out an Indigenous History of the United States, which I read just a couple of months ago in our men's book club, and it was just eye-opening, and it was heart-rending as well, because I came to understand all of that's happened between our history. And I guess I learned it in this kind of vague way, but to sit and read slaughter after slaughter after slaughter after slaughter, and then the ripping up of people and moving them, which this brings me back to the land acknowledgement. I think this land acknowledgement, I mean, there are a lot of things to be done, particularly, I mean, you highlighted some, but this land acknowledgement to me is really, really critical. And it isn't just a ritual. To me, I mean, I think ritual, the reason why we do things over and over, we pray every day, all is because those do have power. And I think being able to state the land and whose it was and what's happened since is really important. In fact, in my syllabus, I have this as the first thing I have in my syllabus at Concordia. This is what I acknowledge that Concordia University, Texas is located on the unceded and traditional territory of numerous indigenous peoples, namely the Cocos, the Dedos, the Tonkawas, and the Lipan Apaches. Others are unknown. I recognize our indebtedness to the original keepers of the land our university occupies in Central Texas. And I do that every year, and students ask, why do you do that? And I said, I just want us to be aware. And just that little bit, it's an educational process, and I think that's so critical for us to do that here as well.
Excellent.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, this is absolutely stunning. I sitting here listening to Canon John's intro and educational. It's just painful. It's painful to hear about those atrocities that took place. And I must confess that I was unaware of some of those things, and it's just painful. It just reminds me of what took place in the U.S. And I think the healing that we talked about and the reconciliation between the Native indigenous people and faith communities is something that we certainly need to do. And I would be interested to know what are those churches doing, the churches that you mentioned, what are they doing in the effort to reconcile and to make things right? Because we know that from a religious standpoint, spiritual standpoint, we know reconciliation is so crucial. It's biblical. We know that it's biblical. We know that it's the right thing to do. The Lord, instructs us to reconcile, and when we've done, wrong to people, we ought to seek reconciliation. We know it's possible, and it's mandated. I'm hoping that I know in our church over 30 years. Wow, we've had one member that I'm aware of who in America is with a Native American background. And that person was at our church probably for 3 or 4 years. And, we just have not had a good, fellowship or an outreach to the Native indigenous people. And I'm wondering how heavy of a lift that is for the faith community, because everything I hear is that our indigenous folks are pretty private. Some, and I don't think people should use this, but some say they're quite isolated. And I'm wondering, is this a heavy lift to bring us together from faith communities, not the government? I'm pretty sure they have officials that meet with the government officials and everything, but when it comes to the faith communities, pastors and leaders and synagogue leaders, to connect with these people, how heavy of a lift that is, I'm curious.
Some great questions. Let's go to Mel first, and then we'll go back to our original speakers.
Yeah, this is a difficult thing, in part because my church, the Assemblies of God, wasn't even formed until 1914. So we come very late to the party, if you would. But at the same time, I'm an American. And my predecessors, ancestors on my dad's side didn't come until 1880, and my mother's side came in the 1600s. I have a family tree that goes back that far, and settled in New England. But I think just because we're there doesn't mean that we're innocent. I think we are as culpable as anybody else because this is our country, and our country came to be in part by what I would call the genocide of Native American people. So, I think that we have to think about this or rethink about this in the ways that we go about doing things. So, as much as I don't believe that the Assemblies of God ever was participant in many of these abuses and these schools and the change of culture and requirement of change of culture, I still think that there are plenty of things for us to be to ask forgiveness for and to recognize that we are participants as American citizens with all this that went on not only in Canada but also here in the United States. I think I first became aware of Native Americans in our tradition when I was probably 5 years old. We had a Navajo family, an extended family that attended our church. And I remember this one woman crocheted a massive tablecloth, for my parents and gave it to them when they left that church in San Leandro, California, and took a church in Las Vegas, Nevada. That tablecloth we still have. It's a wonderful memory of these Navajo people that were part of our congregation. But it's also the case that growing up in Las Vegas, I was aware of Indian reservations that were very near us, the Paiutes and so forth. And I was also aware that the only churches that were established in those little reservations were established by women, single women mostly, in our denomination, and they would go out there and they would serve 15 or 20 people or whatever. Now today we have a reasonably good-sized group of Native Americans within the Assemblies of God. I think we have roughly 200 churches, so we have 50,000 members. But I also have another memory of being on a plane one time coming from Los Angeles, and I don't remember what tribe this woman was from, but she had been brought up in one of these schools in the United States. I believe she was an Apache. And she talked about how difficult it was to be a Christian in this. And it turns out she was a Methodist. And she said, we were not allowed to play our own instruments. We were not allowed women were not allowed to do anything, and it goes on down the line, all these things that had been suppressed, including the language question and so forth. That was really new to me when she told me. That's got to be 35 years ago at least when I met her. And so I've had these memories in my mind, and I have spent an enormous amount of time looking at the origins of Pentecostalism in the United States, which in my estimation are largely influenced by African Americans. But when I go back to the Azusa Street Mission, which has been the focal point of much of my work, there were Native Americans there. They were present, not only North Americans, but also from Mexico. There were quite a number. So what I really think has been good about our church, and this is, I'll say good about our church, is that in the 1920s, they began recognizing that they needed to bring up indigenous leadership. We violated all the rules that the Protestant churches in the United States had about racial mixing within the area, about women in leadership, about the role of laity within the church, and authoritarianism from the denomination. We were quite independent and so forth, which I think was our salvation in terms of how to relate to these Native American experiences. So I don't want to say we're without guilt and, just look at us, but I would say the very fact that we work to indigenize the work right from the start makes a lot of difference.
Excellent. Anyone want to add anything before our break about solutions? How we live?
I would just like to say that Canada has had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and one of the things in that Truth and Commission report is calling upon the churches to apologize. And the Anglican Church, the Presbyterian Church, and the United Church have all apologized. And it's very hopeful that when the members of the First Nations go to the Vatican to meet with Pope Francis in December, that there will be apology from the Roman Catholics as well.
Okay, what an excellent conversation. Thank you all very much. Let's have a break.
We hope you are enjoying today's program. If you would like to learn more about the American Religious Town Hall, please visit our website at americanreligious.org. That's americanreligious.org. There you can read about the mission and history of the program, learn about the Town Hall estates, and view past programs by clicking the appropriate menu buttons. Each week, Pastor Lutz looks forward to receiving your letters. You may write to him at the address shown on your screen. Send your letters to Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. That's Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. Thank you for writing, and thank you for watching. And now, back to you and today's closing statements.
Thank you and welcome back. As you've heard, we've got a conversation that really makes us think about our connection to our past, our responsibilities for the past, actions we may not have taken, and what do we do when we see hurting communities. Great conversation, and we're now going to give everyone opportunity to give their closing thought, starting out here with you, Mel.
Well, thank you. I think it's really important that Americans in particular recognize the fact that we have done disservice, genocide, to Native Americans in this country, and we need to really come to terms with that. We never have. We've never apologized to these people. We set them up on reservations to keep them away from us and theoretically to allow them to prosper, but the only thing that we have given to them are casinos these days, which I don't think is the best use of their time, money, or policy.
Thank you. Carl.
I want to quote from C.F.W. Walter, who was the first president of the Lutheran Church in Missouri Synod back in the, I believe it was in the 1860s or 70s that he said, I don't know the date, but nevertheless, he said, "We are living on the indigenous people's hills and on their grounds. We pasture our herds on their prairies. We cut our wood in their forests. We travel on their streams and rivers. They accuse us before God, and we hear the words from their mouths. There stand our enemies. They drove us out of the earthly fatherland which we owned. They have taken away our temporal property and fortune. They have spilled our blood and have irritated our souls." This is someone in the 1800s, the first president of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. This is a call for reconciliation. Anyway, no, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
I haven't had time to do a deep dive into this one article titled "A Progressive Facade," comparing the U.S. and Canada's treatment of the indigenous people. And one of the paragraphs says, while at first glance, the relationship between the Canadian government and First Nations people may appear progressive, conciliatory, and apologetic, these symbolic gestures actually belie a federal reluctance to extend political sovereignty to all the First Nations. And this is a pretty extensive article. And again, I haven't had time to do a deep dive, but I think it's certainly worth looking into. And again, my words in the last segment is that I think this is just, it's heartbreaking to hear the type of treatment that that these people went through. But, we should always, as we know, acknowledge our wrongs, acknowledge our sins, and repent from these things and ask for forgiveness. And I think you also have to put some action to the words. Words are very important. I think when we apologize, that means a lot, but there should be some actions. What those actions are, I would like to see what they are, because I do know from a faith standpoint, our faith communities, it might be a heavy lift to kind of get us together. I wish we could see that happen more broadly and more intentional, so that we can, because our multi-ethnic communities are beautiful, and we ought to do everything we can to really try to bring us together and bring some healing to this situation.
Thank you very much. John?
Thank you. We've been speaking about healing, and the out of the 94 resolutions that came out from the commission, they call for an apology. On the Friday, August 6, 1993, the Archbishop of Canada, Michael Piers, issued this apology at the National Native Convention. Of course, August 6th is also the bombing of Hiroshima. And I would like to read his apology. And might all of us, as we listen to this, accept it in our own prayers. I accept and I confess before God and you our failures in the residential schools. We failed you. We failed ourselves. We failed God. I am sorry, more than I can say, that we were a part of a system that took you and your children away from your home and family. I am sorry, more than I can say, that we tried to remake you in our image, taking away your language and the signs of your identity. I am sorry, more than I can say, that in our schools so many were abused physically, sexually, culturally, and emotionally. On behalf of the Anglican Church of Canada, I present our apology. This Friday, the day of Jesus' suffering and death, it is the anniversary of the first atomic bomb in Hiroshima, one of the most horrid, terrible injuries ever inflicted by one people on another. But even atomic bombs and Good Friday are not the last word. God raised Jesus from the dead as a sign that life and wholeness are the everlasting and unquenchable purposes of God. Michael, Archbishop and Primate.
Thank you all very much, and thank you for those that are listening. The Charter of the American Religious Town Hall provides that Roman Catholics, Protestants, Jews, educators, and others may appear on this program and can declare their beliefs without hesitancy. And the rest of the members of the panel will uphold and guarantee that American right to all who will appear, irrespective of race or creed, so that the rest of the world can see that here in America, we believe in civil and religious freedom, not only in theory, but in reality. And now, friends, until next week at the same time and over the very same channel, the American Religious Town Hall meeting stands adjourned. May the God of all of us bless all of you.